be learning about note values. Now in the last segment we introduced sections that you were already working with, and that is quarter notes, eighth notes, and 16th notes, but we'll go more in depth and explain how those work. The first thing that we start with in music is the biggest one, the biggest note value, which we call the whole note. Actually, let me move it down here a little more. A whole note doesn't have what we call a stem. It's just open in the middle. And when I think of a whole note, it's like a whole piece of pie or a whole pizza. Nothing is taken out of it. When you have a whole of something in music, it's worth 4. Now we're not going to talk about beats or anything right now. We're just going to talk about amounts. So this is worth 4. Then if I were to break this whole note into 2 equal pieces, those 2 equal pieces would look like this. Each of these is called a half note. So it's half of the whole note. Now a half note, you can recognize it because it has an open circle like the whole note, but it also has a stem. Now each half note that you see here is worth 2. Doing our math, 2 plus 2 equals 4, so they've taken a half. Now if I wanted to separate this again and divide my half note into 2 equal parts, so I'm going to divide this one and this one into 2 equal parts. The next one that we get is what's called the quarter note. Now in our last lesson I introduced you to these. If you didn't have that on there, that would be the ta that we were looking at. Okay? And since we broke those up, 2 split into equal sections is 1. So each one of these is 1. And 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 4, which is also equal to the whole note. So 4 of these, 4 quarter notes, can fit inside of a whole note. Okay, we can break this up even further. If I want to break that quarter note up into 2 equal parts, and I'll use a different color here. So each one of these can break up. You may recognize this in math. We used to do this. It's called the factor tree. Now these may look familiar from the last lesson as well. You see that the 2 stems that are connected at the top with a bar, these are eighth notes. So there's 8 of them. 8 of these can fit into a whole note, and they are half, each one is worth half of a beat. Or, as we were learning it, T, T. Ta, T, T. So each one is worth a half. Now the last one we're going to learn about, we can break this up one more. Break each eighth note up. Sorry, a lot of writing here. This will also look familiar to you because we did this in the last lesson. And a good way to practice this is try drawing this yourself. It's really helpful to take the time to do this. Helps get it into your mind and helps you remember this much better. So I would encourage you to write this down yourself. Okay, so that was a lot of drawing. But you can see that we have 16 little note heads here called 16th notes. Each of these 16th notes is 1/4 of a beat. Okay, and these you also recognize because we did these in the last lesson. These were the ones that we called tiri-tiri. So if I was to just start right here where we did our rhythm lessons before, and if we just said these together, ta, 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 ti, 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 tiri, 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 tiri. Does that look familiar? Let's do that one more time. Ta, 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 ti, 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 tiri, 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 tiri. So you already recognize the quarters, the eighths, and the 16ths from the rhythm exercise that we did. So now we just need to decide what we're going to call these. And this is what I use. I call this one, and I apologize if this is elementary, but I teach a lot of young kids. I call this one great big whole note. So that's 4 counts. Great big whole note. That takes me 4 to say that. And for this one, I just say half note. So now here's where I'm going to introduce the term beat. The best way to describe beat is if you think about your own heartbeat. It's constant, it's steady. When you exercise, it goes faster, so the tempo can go up or down, but it stays constant. So if you were to feel your pulse, that's a beat. It stays constant. Another way to think about it is if you look at the second hand on a clock. It ticks at each second and is constant. It doesn't ever change. That's a beat. A beat is constant. It never changes. So if I were just to keep a beat like that, then I could do each of these. Great, big, whole note. Half note. Ta, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ti. Tiri, 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 tiri. Let's try that again. I'll establish the beat. It's constant. It never changes. Here we go. Great, big, whole note. Half note. Ta, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ti. Tiri, 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 tiri. Great job. I encourage you to try this yourself. Draw out this factor tree, as it were, and practice that and do the exercise that we just did. The next segment will be on taking all of these and putting them together to do complex rhythms.